Well, what a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invite. I'm delighted to come. So if you haven't heard of Utah, Utah's a beautiful place to live and work. This is Salt Lake City, where I'm from. I was actually born and bred there, so I'm a little bit biased, but it's heavenly. You've got right here our lab right here, which is a beautiful place. Although we mostly do informatics, about a third of my group is experimental, so we actually have fume hoods. We have things, we actually make stuff in our lab. And what's slick is that within 30 minutes of there, you can be up skiing in just some world-class skiing. This year we had over 900 inches of snow. It broke all the records, and I wasn't there for it. It's killing me. But it's an amazing place, so if you're ever in Salt Lake City, come drop by and say hi. So I'm going to start my talk by showing two groups of faces. The first group is this one, the people that make all this work possible. I have the pleasure of coming here to Berlin and telling you about this awesome stuff, but I don't do most of it. It's these wonderful folks. So I'm going to try and point out individual contributions when I get to them, but we have 10 PhD students in our group and about 5 masters. It's fairly big, and funding from a lot of different agencies. In particular, I do need to point out the NSF and the Royal Society Wolfson Foundation, which is allowing me to be here today. Okay. Now, the second group of faces I want to show you is more related to the topic of today's discussion, which is this one here. This came from a tweet from Ian Goodfellow. Maybe some of you, if you're doing informatics, are familiar with who this guy is. He was a grad student, and he was the one who invented the generative adversarial network, which is a tool for doing generative modeling, right? He did it as a grad student, which I think is amazing, right? In 2014, I think is at Montreal. Anyways, this tweet came later. He went on to go work for Google and Apple and DeepMind and then back to Google, or was it Apple? Anyways, he's been everywhere. But in 2018, he made this tweet. And it was basically showing the incredible rate of progress that we've seen in generative models for faces, right? Which is like the big case study that they were working on initially. Where this was from his master or PhD dissertation. This one over here, which is it a face? Yes. Is it a very convincing one? Not particularly, right? And yet, in short order, at the time he made this tweet, we had it to here. In 2021, I updated it because NVIDIA's StyleGAN came out. And now, gosh, I should do it again because it's just getting better. And now we've moved on to video. We've moved on to a gazillion other things. And the point of this tweet was just the remarkable rate of progress. And so the question that we're going to be asking is, can we expect to see similar things for materials, right? Can we use these generative models to do something for materials? And maybe before that, we have to the question, can machine learning do something generative at all? I know 10 years ago when I was starting in this area, I'd go around giving talks about machine learning, and I'd always, without fail, I would get a question, yeah, but this can only interpolate between data points it's seen. It's never going to do anything new, right? And so can it do something new? I've become really convinced that it can, right? We've seen, remember 3 years ago now, when DALL-E showed up and everyone was making these, type in the text prompt and outcomes and image. And this is not like it found of the available images online the one that was closest to it. It created something new by sampling from the latent space with this conditional, with this text condition that you're providing, right? Now you can go ahead and take my kid's favorite children's book and I could animate it myself if I wanted to, right? And then you go, and there's so many more things you can do with it. Like here's one I published maybe a few months ago, where I was making a software tutorial showing how you can use ChatGPT to avoid coding altogether to make really nice scientific figures. So in the thing, I was talking to my computer, generative model, takes your voice and turns it into text. I was asking it to do things, right? And it was using text generating models to actually generate the code that goes along with it. With a few iterations, you're able to make these amazing figures. And then just because I was going to throw it on YouTube, I went ahead and did a little bit further, and I did a StyleGAN version of myself to take regular Taylor and turn him into superhero Taylor so I could have a clickbaity image to go with the fingernail. Just like what can't generative models do? And every day, there's just more and more and more coming out. So I've become convinced that, yeah, there is something to this. Now, if we're going to be materials researchers, the next obvious question is, like, how do we harness it for materials tasks, right? The benefit is that we have a lot of really great work that's come before us, right? We have just next door in the computer science buildings, people churning out these incredible generative models, which makes it really easy for us to not have to invent those in the first place, but rather adapt them to our domain, whether it's physics or chemistry or materials, right? So here's 4 of the common generative models that you might choose from. I'm going to show you the results from a few of these in today's talk, but there's more coming up every day, right? The state of the art lasts like 6 months, and it's already, sort of old news. And yet, if you take these sort of, like this was with DALL-E, right? If I go to DALL-E and I say, all right, here's what I want you to give me an oxide crystal structure with offset layers of corner-shared ALO6 octahedra, rare earth-filled interstitials, this is what it gives me, right? It doesn't understand what you in this room know I'm looking for, which is something like a sieve card. I want to see where the atoms are located. I want to see the connected polyhedra, and we're not getting that here, right? So again, will it get there? And if so, what do we have to do to help it get there, right? So I'm going to step back a little bit and say our sort of journey in trying to answer this question. We started with a very simple test case, which is using style transfer to try and achieve inverse design. The students that worked on this were Kai Kawe, he now works for Citrine Informatics, and Andrew Falkowski, who works for Ultra Safe Nuclear Corporation, which is the best name I've ever heard for a company. If you're not familiar with style transfer is slick. It came out of 2015 from the Gaddis group. So the idea is that you take the content of one image. This is actually a German, the Neckarfront, I think, place in Germany. If you wanted to take the content of this image, but then map it over with the style of something else, like Edvard Munch's Der Schrei, you can do that. So the tools that they developed in style transfer to do that relied on convolutional neural networks, which I'm guessing most people in this room understand, but if you don't, it doesn't matter. And by the way, this is nowadays, if you use any of these Voila apps or Lenza, they're all doing the same thing. It's all using versions of style transfer. Retain the style of something while mapping images. So you've got my daughter in various versions, or when you superheroify yourself, it's doing the exact same thing. So the way they do it is with convolutional neural networks. If you don't know how these work, it doesn't matter. There's two important steps that they do that allow us to do the separation of content and style. There's convolutions and there's pooling, right? A convolution is a process where you apply a kernel to something and it's going to automatically extract the style. What's interesting is in the early days, they were actually guessing what the kernel ought to be. The most early examples, they had face detection software for cameras. I don't know if you guys were around when they were doing this, but when I was graduating from high school, I got my very first camera where I could point it at somebody and it put a little box around the face. It somehow knew that was a face. It wasn't using convolutional neural networks like in the year 2000. It was using a filter. It was what's the guy's name? Hans or something? Haas filter. It basically realized that you have dark spots where your eyes are, you have a white spot here, and you have a dark spot where your mouth is. So they would just apply that filter over different regions, and they would learn that's basically, odds of it being a face are pretty good. So what's slick about convolutional neural networks is that instead of having to know what a face looks like, where you brought that domain knowledge to the filter, we just let it learn it automatically. The kernels are automatically learned, and that's going to be learning the style of your image. Now, the other thing that they use is pooling. Pooling takes, and it essentially is going to reduce the number of pixels to just the most important ones, which is going to allow us to extract the content. So the clever bit behind style transfer is simply saying, all right, if we have this way to independently separate out style and transfer, then when you bring in a new image or random noise or whatever you're doing, you're just going to minimize the difference between the desired content and the desired style. And so you can actually run these in reverse and do style transfer. So we had this idea, like, let's do this with materials, right? We're not talking about images of materials. I want to actually define a material and then use it to inversely design some sort of property. So in that case, you have to have a representation of your material. And there's a gazillion out there. This is one of the strengths of our field. Over the last 10 years, we've come up with a lot of ways to represent materials because we didn't have data. We already sort of had the algorithms from computer science. The big thing that we needed to figure out in the absence of data, what we needed was better representations to learn on limited data. So there's been lots of these things that have come out. The simplest might be a one-hot encoding, or what we often call a composition-based feature vector with no features, right? You're just giving it the elements and maybe their prevalence. So it's sort of like a fractional encoding. I'm going to say element number 8 and 13 are present because it's aluminum oxygen, and then maybe I'm going to tell it the fractional amounts of those. This would be a very simplistic way to represent your materials. And there's much more complicated ones, but for today's example, let's start with that. So if that's your representation, now if you want to do inverse design, you have to be able to take that representation, pass it through some sort of machine learning model, and get a prediction of some sort of maybe property that you're interested in. So we did this using the paper that we came up with, using CRABNet. If you can check it out if you want. You could do many others. Roost is a good one. There's others out there. A lot of them do need structure. The benefit of CRABNet and Roost is they are structure agnostic. You only need the chemistry, right? If you got the chemistry, something like a composition-based feature vector, it will work. So I won't describe how CRABNet works today. At the time, it was novel in that it included attention. Nowadays, most things include attention. It's a powerful learning mechanism. But it passes through attention and then a neural network, and out comes a single property prediction. You could make it multi-objective if you want. But this is, let's say it's a property. You're after a certain band gap, for example. How do you make this inverse design? The idea that we had was to take style transfer, right? We said, all right, you're trying to find a new material with maybe a specific value of a band gap or whatever else. What we're going to do is we're going to leave the content the same. We're going to say, in this chemical system, leave that constant. Tell me the ratio that we ought to use to maximize, minimize, or set some value of this objective function. And I was kind of skeptical that this would work, but it actually has. In fact, we've been able to expand this to not just single objectives, but multi-objectives. In fact, if you have a GitHub repository, you've probably met my student Sterling, who's probably commented on it and raised an issue or something. And he's done a great job of releasing a series of tutorial videos on multi-objective optimization, which you can check out. But here's how it worked when we gave it a shot. On the left, you see the loss, right? We're trying to drive the loss down. This is basically a measurement of how far was your outcome from the desired outcome. So we're trying to drive that down. And then Epoch's showing you, as you train this model over and over, you're allowing it to change something. What we're changing is the style, the ratio of the elements. And what we're doing in this case is we asked it to maximize bulk modulus. So in that system that we were working in, maximize modulus, you see that over time it's struggling, and then it figures out how to do it, and it takes off. What's slick is this exact same problem. You can map what it's doing to the chemistry at the same time. You can see it started with, we gave it an equimolar mixture of titanium, cadmium, and carbon, just because we gave those just as a shot. We knew that a hard material is probably going to be a titanium carbide. Cadmium's not doing anything for you. So we were curious, will the model know to turn it off? And it does. And it tries a few things. It thinks maybe I keep it no, and it eventually kills it. And then it even fixes the ratio of titanium to carbon to the approximate ratio. By the way, we did this by holding out all titanium carbide examples in our training data set. So it's not just like it found the nearest one in the labeled data we had, and yet it knew that being a little bit rich in carbon is the right way to go. And those, I don't know if anybody works in titanium carbide, but that's the correct answer there. So interesting first case study. Can we do a little bit more? Let's try a multi-objective one. This time we're going to introduce two objectives. We defined them strictly and said, let's maximize bulk modulus, but we care equally about minimizing decomposition energy, right? So give me a stable material that's high modulus. This time we gave it 4 different elements, calcium, aluminum, silicon, and oxygen. And at first you see it doesn't know what to do with calcium. It thinks it ought to include it, but as the model runs forward using gradient descent, right, it's iteratively making changes. It's figuring out how to actually approach something a little bit better. So then we tried to break it. We said, you know, what can this actually, what's the extent to which we can use this? One way to break it would be to give it many, many objectives maybe. Or another one would be to give it many different chemistries to start with. Remember, this data is trained off of DFT data, things like Materials Project, where the vast majority of compounds are single elements, binaries, ternaries, maybe a few quaternaries. Once you go up to quinaries and beyond, there's very, very few. They represent probably less than 5% of the total entries. So it's never seen compounds that are complex, and most of those don't exist in nature, right? Pauling pointed this out 100 years ago with his 5th rule. Parsimony said compounds tend to be simple. So if we give it 10 different elements to start with, we were curious if it would use them all, and it doesn't. It turns off about half of them pretty quickly, which is pretty slick to see. Now, this is not perfect. It has a lot of problems. One of the biggest problems is that the chemistries that it settles with are silly, right? They violate electron counting. There's no known structure. You're not guaranteed that, you don't even know what the structure is, right? Because this is a structure agnostic approach. But was it a sort of first approach? It was sort of okay. How do you do better? Another problem we ran into is that as you see these steps, when it's changing its chemistry, it's really, really slow. The steps it's taking are really slow. Now you could change your optimizer and force it to take bigger steps. But you always, with gradient descent, are going to run into the problem that in the solution space available to you, because you're just trying to drive that loss down, you can end up in situations where you're driving it down and you get stuck in these local minima. The best solution might be over here, but to get there, you technically have to go up in your loss function a little bit. And optimizers try and get around that, but it's just a fundamental limitation of gradient descent. And yet, this is the overwhelming majority of machine learning, materials informatics, is gradient descent based. But there's other tools out there, right? There's lots of other black box optimization approaches which you could rely on. So here we're going to take the exact same approach that we're trying to do inverse design, but we're going to do it not using gradient descent. We're going to use it with a genetic algorithm. I'm guessing everyone here knows what genetic algorithms are in the space of materials, but briefly I'll say that they work kind of just like nature. They were inspired by nature. In nature, you have genes from more fit parents will be able to then have children, send their genes forward, and less fit parents won't be able to. We're going to take the exact same idea. We're going to have to identify some sort of selection criteria. We're going to have to identify crossover criteria, mutation, right? All these same steps, we're going to have to define them for materials and figure out how we can pass healthy genes forward that are better towards your objective function, right? Now, the benefit of this and why it's better than gradient descent is because you don't just give it the top 2 parents and pass it forward. That would look a lot like gradient descent. Instead, you say, give me the best examples, but give me some of the medium or even bad ones. Like the Scottish red deer algorithm, for example, takes some of the very worst ones and randomly injects a few of those into the gene pool, if you will, with the idea that you're going to be able to sample broader regions of your solution space. Now, this is not perfect because there's a lot of operations that have to take place here. For all of your candidates, you're going to generate some pool of candidates, and you're only going to pass forward some of them. So there's a bunch of wasted calculations for the ones that don't go forward. But then you have to combine genes, and you have to figure out, like there's a lot of details, and there's a lot of calculations. For example, we define our materials gene, right? We had to, we're, by the way, using the non-dominated sorting genetic algorithm 2, NSGA2, something that existed. We just modified it for our approach here with our representation. You had to say, like, okay, if you've got two parents and they both share one element, like the dark blue, and they both share the light blue element, but if one can, if they don't agree on the other elements, how do you pick which elements go forward, right? Is it random? Is it scored based off of which parent had a stronger selection criteria? These are all tunable parameters you have to figure out. Another one, how about this? Okay, if you're going to combine parents, like I have dark hair, my wife has blonde hair, and all my kids have blonde hair, right? They took after one parent, not after the other, right? But sometimes my kids have like a mixture of features, right? And this is another tunable parameter. You can say that the offspring generation are going to be more like one parent or the other, or you can even blur it so they become in between. So lots and lots of things that you can attempt here. We used it essentially out of the box. We didn't mess with it too much. And yet here's what we get. So here we were asking it to do a multi-objective optimization. We wanted it to minimize thermal conductivity, minimize decomposition energy, and the best materials exist along this Pareto front. So when we look at those, well, first thing we notice is that they're mostly nonsense. It's a lot of chemistries that you can never make in the lab or are radioactive or things like that. So we threw those out, and then we kept the ones in blue, which we thought, yeah, feasibly somebody could probably try and make that. And then what I think where it becomes interesting is when you compare this to gradient descent. What you see in these light teal circles is the results of gradient descent. In in thousands of steps, right, and as it trains these things, it's slowly learning how to turn thermal conductivity, lower, but it's getting stuck in this sort of decomposition enthalpy space because it's stuck at a certain chemistry. We didn't give it the freedom to explore other chemistries. We just gave it freedom to explore the ratio of the elements, whereas the genetic algorithm can really much more broadly explore it in very few iterations. Here's another example. We're trying to get high mobility, high electron mobility, low thermal conductivity. The gradient descent is slowly driving conductivity down, but it's struggling to find ways to increase mobility, whereas the genetic algorithm just wildly explores this solution space much more effectively. Again, not necessarily faster, because genetic algorithms are a ton of wasted calculations, but in fewer data points you get a much better exploration of your space. So I don't know, taking all this together and coming back to our sort of roadmap picture for today's talk, I'd say, is this sort of inverse design what we want it to be for materials informatics? What I want it to be is real materials discovery, right? Give me some new material. And this falls short of that because some of the things it spits out may be unstable. They may have sort of crazy chemistries. So it's less like this and maybe more like that in terms of the faces, right? It's a sort of like what we were trying to achieve, but it's not quite there yet. So can we do better? To answer this question, this actually started during COVID. Our labs were closed, and so my students wanted to work on things because they still wanted to graduate. So Michael Alverson and Zahra Gholami started working on this. And Michael had the idea, which I thought was an interesting but maybe a bad one at first. He said, all right, we want to define these materials, and we've tried the composition-only approach. What we're missing is structure. And yet, most of the approaches that you use for crystalline materials don't work because there's no invertible structure. Meaning you can't take the sieve card information and invert it for inverse design. You can't say, like, with this target property, now give me the structure that belongs to it. There was no representation that allowed us to do that at the time. So he's like, well, what if we took the actual information in that sieve card itself and tried to predict from the sieve card? In other words, could you build some sort of model, language or otherwise, that just predicts the values that would populate a sieve card? Because if you can make a sieve card, you've got the crystal structure and the composition all there. So I thought, yeah, give it a go. I don't think it'll work, but maybe it'll solve some of the problems. Because in chemistry, they don't have this problem. If you don't worry about how the molecules crystallize, and you just want to make a molecule, then there's lots of ways to do that. But as soon as you start saying, and it has to have this crystallizing, symmetry, the translation, the rotations, all these things, there was no approach for this. So I'd love to say that we were the first ones here, but we technically got beat by our friends at MIT and Singapore just by a few months. We sort of independently developed it. And if you look at the approaches, they're actually quite similar. On the left, you've got Tonio's group with their FTCP, they call it, the Fourier Transform Crystal, I don't remember what it stands for. But if you look at it, it's got the lattice information, it's got the site coordination matrix, it's got the same stuff that's in the sieve card, essentially. Now, they added also the Fourier transforms, because they thought that was important. I've since deleted that out in testing it, and it doesn't really kill the performance. So I wonder how important the Fourier part of the FTCP is, but maybe. We did something very similar. They passed theirs through a VAE, and they showed that they could do inverse design using a VAE as a generative model. We're going to show you what we did with something slightly different with crystal to ping. And just to sort of not bury the lead, in 18 months, we've come a long ways to the point where it's actually turning out pretty convincing things now. we were using generative adversarial networks in early days. Again, I'm guessing most folks are familiar with that, but if you're not familiar with a GAN, a generative adversarial network, it kind of does what the name suggests. It's generative, it's going to make something new, and it's going to do that by putting two neural networks and pitting them against one another. You're going to have your generator, which is a neural network, which is going to take something and produce something that has the components of the sieve card in it, right? It's going to tell you your lattice information, it's going to tell you the element information in some sort of representation, right? So its job is to generate those sort of randomly. You can condition it, but for right now we did it randomly. And then you've got a discriminator up there, and the discriminator's job is just to say, if I know what real structures look like, because I have a bunch of examples, and I got these fake ones, can I tell which one's which? And the better that the discriminator gets at telling the real from the fake, then the better the generator must get at generating better fakes. This all looks really simple, like you draw these little lines like, oh, backpropagation magic's going to make this easy. In practice, this is horrible. GANs are highly, highly likely to diverge. They're not stable because they don't have a single loss function. It's two separate neural networks that you're sort of tying together with like duct tape. Like it's very, very difficult to make it converge without, it's possible, but it's hard. One thing we learned early on to make it more likely to converge and not diverge in this process is that we knew that the discriminator had the easier job. It's much harder for the generator to make something that looks real than for the discriminator to say, oh, that's obviously the fake. So one thing we can do to improve this is by including this step here in the middle. This is our convex hull distance calculation. What comes out of our generator is a sieve card. Well, what's great about a sieve card is that there's lots of machine learning models that can predict distance from convex hull. And they're not perfect, but they're not bad, right? It's certainly good enough to throw out the vast majority of nonsense structures. So we do that, and all of a sudden the models are much more likely to converge than not. Okay. So now we need the information from the sieve card. Anybody who's opened these knows what there is. It's the lattice parameters, the angles, the space group, and the basis. It's not that much information, and you can fully define the crystalline structure. You're not going to define dislocations or dopants or defects, things like that, but you can define the structure, right? So the good news is that there's tools for doing this. PyMat Gen makes it easy to extract this sort of information. In Python, it's a breeze. There's also lots of databases. There's the Cambridge. Here in Germany, maybe you like the ICSD a little bit better. There's lots of them. We use the PCD because we're cheap and that's what we have, right? It had 300,000 sieve cards. About half of those had the structure and the basis. A lot of them only had the lattice unit cell, the symmetry, and the lattice. They didn't know where the actual atoms were. So we had about 150,000, which included all the information we need. And that should be enough to train some of these deep learning models on. So the last thing we needed, and what the field was waiting for, was some sort of invertible representation. So here's our clunky first approach. It was not great, but it actually worked, sort of. Again, all the information that you need is your ABC, alpha, beta, gamma, a space group number, and then you need to encode the information of the basis. Now, we did it originally as a vector, right? You could have done that just along one line, like a 1 by 52 or something, vector. We found that it was much more stable, though, because remember, we're dealing with GANs, which are unstable, if we did some averaging. So then we introduced, let's do 7 different rows and average across those. So instead of just trusting that the C value is correct, what if you average 7 different predictions of what the C does it do a little bit better? And it did. It did a little bit better. It also offered us some benefits that now we could define each column as an element in the basis, where you can define its ABC, XYZ positions independently, which was convenient as well. We didn't encode things like thermal displacement parameters, or I don't even know if we did occupancy in this first approach. Okay, so we do this, my student does it, and then he sends me the sieve card, and he's so excited because it was stable, right? Just getting the GAN stable to train something, then he gets these sieve cards coming out, and he sends one to me, and I go to open it, and we get all these errors, like all the errors. And one of the first things it said is, the space group, for example, was over 195, so it's cubic, and yet A, B, C aren't equal to one another, right? So the generative model didn't know rules of symmetry that we in this room understand and know, and so it was making arbitrary assignments. So we did have to introduce some constraints. So we said, okay, if the space group is between these numbers, then we're going to have to round the lattice parameters to maybe average them out or round them to different ratios to force it to comply with some symmetry constraints. We did that, great. So then he does it again, gets it to converge. Then he sends it to me, and it fails again. We get more errors. This time, the atomic numbers that he was using a regressor to predict the atomic numbers. So that means it's going to come up with non-integer values, right? It's going to say, oh, it's element number 11.117 or something, right? So what does that mean? So you could say, oh, easy, we're just going to round it to the nearest integer. That's easy. But that doesn't work either, because look what that'll do. If that's this, you're going to end up with, well, what compound has all these things in it? That doesn't make any sense at all. So no compounds are going to have up to 52 different elements, because we gave it up to 52 different spots in the basis, which encompasses most materials. It's not going to be 52 different elements. So the way we got around this is we used k-means clustering. We said, all right, everything that comes out of this, force it into a K2, K3, K4, so that we get binary, ternary, and quaternary versions of that. And it did a better job, right? So it would take this output and squish it into something that looks more like that, which might be more reasonable. All this work, we finally get the first sieve card to open. I remember sitting at my desk when he sent it to me, and it's this one. It's this one right here. And it was so bad. I literally told him, like, I'm glad you gave this a shot. I'm sad you spent so much time on it, though, because this isn't going anywhere. It was a good idea. Let's put it to bed and move on to something else. And he's like, no, because this is just vanilla GAN. And I was like, what's a vanilla GAN? He's like, oh, it's a GAN, but you haven't messed with it yet. Like, we're going to mess with it. We can change things. We can add convolutional layers. We can add LSTM layers. And so he starts trying all these things. And I don't know. It's better than like the gumball machine on the left, but like it's not convincing anybody. My goal was like, what if we could fool my chemist buddies, right? What if we could show them a structure and they think it's a real one? And this isn't fooling anybody, right? So one of the problems that we were running into with these early GAN implementations was actually, and by the way, yeah, it's like, and sort of our timeline, these things look like worse than our inverse design stuff. The problem we were running into is that in early days, the function that the discriminator is using, right? So it's a neural network and it passes down to a single node, right? And in that node, you pass it through an activation function. Now, computer scientists love this. This is a sigmoid function. They love it because it does a pretty good job of splitting things between 0 and 1, right? So the neural network compresses down to a single node. So you have a single value there, right? If that value is a big negative number and you pass it through the sigmoid, it flattens to 0. If it's a big positive number, it goes to 1. So it's a good discriminator, right? There's very small regions here in the middle where there's ambiguity. It usually says real or fake pretty definitively. The problem is that if you're using your generative model where each time you want to learn from that and pass that information back to the generator so it gets better at doing its job, what you run into is the diminishing gradient zone problem. The slope of this is related to the backpropagation step size change that you're going to make to it. And essentially, it's disappearing. So the better and better that we were getting, the worse and worse feedback we were giving to the generator. It's like running a marathon. The example I always give is like if you're running a marathon and at mile 23, as you get closer, you start moving slower and slower, is essentially kind of what was happening here. So how do you fix that? Well, there's lots of ways. You can use a different activation function, would be one thing. But even a better way to do it would be, don't take this entire big representation of material, which is a whole big matrix, and try and compress it down to a single data point to do your comparison. Instead, compare all of your representation. And the way that we do that is with the Wasserstein algorithm, or the Earth mover's distance, sometimes it's called. If you're not familiar with this, it takes some sort of, in this case, it's going to take our representation, and it's going to recast it as a cumulative distribution function. So it's not a single point. You're replotting it as sort of like a Gaussian, if you will. It's not quite, but it's sort of like that. And then you're going to say, these two Gaussian curves, how are they similar or dissimilar from one another? A really simplistic approach would be to say, well, the mean of them is separated by some distance, so that's reducing it down to a scalar. But you can do better than that. You can say, and they call it the Earth mover's distance, because if you imagine sort of a tractor moving, if this was a pile of dirt in blue and a pile of dirt in green, how much energy would a tractor have to do to move that distribution to make it match the other one, hence the name. So this is just a much better tool for comparing distributions. In this case, it's going to allow us to compare materials. And the benefit is that in the end, we get a linear activation function. So no matter if it makes a terrible material or a great one, we're getting useful information for the next pass. And so I think about 18 months ago, we presented this at the fall MRS meeting. And I was pretty excited about it. I said, OK, of these 8 materials that now with this new Wasserstein GAN model, can you tell me which 4 are fake and which 4 are real? And if I told you the chemistries, and if we ran any of these through CheckSieve, right, you would know immediately what they are. But at least it's getting better. It's much better than the gumball things that we saw originally, but it's still not there. The big problems that we were running into at this point was the fact that our model was generating the unit cell information, the symmetry, and the basis. And then from that single value of the space group number, we would then apply all the symmetry operators to tell you where the other atoms are. And the problem is that then you're putting things on top of each other, because you never gave it a chance to learn where elements ought to be in the crystal structure relative to one another. And the only way to fix that was to change our representation. Instead of the simple matrix approach that we used earlier, we had to introduce some sort of graph, right? So here's how we did it. We took the same approach that we had before, where we're going to define the atoms in the basis up to 52 different rows. The exact same information is encoded as columns. And then in this region in the middle, we have a direction graph where we can actually encode between every atom in the basis, you can learn what its distance ought to be to everything else. And my student Sterling was clever and said, well, if we can do it with distance, we could add other channels that aren't distance. You could add a channel for electronegativity difference. You could add a channel for number of valence electrons difference, or whatever else you want. Things that they commonly do in composition-based feature vectors, you can encode these as channels. So when he did the first time, he added 3 channels. He encoded the distance as x, y, and z, and he's like, hey, this is an image now. At this point, this is an image, right? You've got a square sort of image here, and then these represent your distances as the RGB values. Hence the name, they called this crystal to ping. And we published this in the Journal of Open Source Software. We've since modified it a fair bit, but it was the first pretty good start. Now, what's great about this is that it's going to allow us to learn those distances. Okay? So for example, if I had the sieve card for a known material, and I know where atoms 1, 2, 3, and 4 are, I can generate this direction graph. I can say, okay, in the x direction, atom 2 is some distance s away from atom 1, and you can do the same for 3 and 4, right? So you can populate this direction graph. The challenge comes when you try and do inverse design with this. Inverse design, when you pass this through a generative model, we're actually going to be generating this and trying to create these atomic positions from it. And that's a much harder thing to do. Like, let me show you an example why. If you look at it, so let's say this was generated by the model. It generated a direction graph for us. Great. So you can look at that and say, okay, from atom 1's perspective, I know where atoms 2, 3, 4, and however many else there are. I know where they are in the different x, y, z directions. The problem is that you have to look at atom 2's perspective, and it has to match. From atom 2's perspective, it knows where 1, 3, and 4 are, and they're not in the exact same spot. The same thing for 3 and for 4. And so you end up with these sort of clouds of where you think the atom is, but it's not like a fixed spot. So how do you deal with this problem? We weren't totally sure. My student said, well, what if we just average it? What if you take the centroid of this? We could do that. So we actually do that. We keep the centroid. But what we decided to do was to hang on to this information of the uncertainty. For example, over here, my hypothesis is that a model with big uncertainties, it's not really sure where to put the atom, is not going to perform as well as one where it's more confident in how it puts them. So we're going to save that information and use that as a measure of goodness of the model, right? What you're seeing here on the rows are different generative models that we tried out. So you see Gans, Wasserstein-Gans, diffusion models, VAEs and flow. We have these coming soon. This is all in the final stages of being published in the journal Patterns. And then on the columns, what you're seeing is the uncertainty in different parts of the information that defines the crystal structure. Like how much uncertainty was there in the lattice parameters if you square that value? How much uncertainty in the angles with the space group? And what I see when I look at this data is about an order of magnitude improvement as you go from a vanilla, very simple GAN to one that uses a Wasserstein, the Earth mover's distance to compare the functions, and then down to diffusion models. And this sort of matches what we're seeing in the image space when they generate fake faces, and it changes all the time. But the general flow has been GANs, Wasserstein-Gans, VAEs, diffusion models. Nowadays, there's GigaGAN, so GANs are making a comeback. Maybe they're going to be better again. But for now, we see that diffusion models are doing pretty great. And you see it in the output. If you actually just let this thing generate structures and look at it, then you can see it. Like, here's the GAN model. It's not good, right? The atoms are on top of each other. The unit cells are always massive. There's not a variety of diversity in the types of structures that it spits out in terms of the unit cell symmetries. So they're not great. The chemistries are obviously crazy too. The Wasserstein-Gan's a little bit better. These are the ones I showed at the meeting 18 months ago. Yeah, it's improved, but it's not really great either. And then when you get to the diffusion model outputs, it starts looking very convincing. These structures look much more realistic. The bond distances are way more realistic. They're way more in line with what you see in real training data sets. Now, there's some problems with this. I presented this at the Gordon Research Conference, and a famous chemist who I will remain nameless saw this, and he's like, Taylor, do you not know anything about electron counting? Because yeah, it's going to turn out things like barium sodium oxide, right? And it's obvious that that thing, electron counting, is not working. But what's slick is that in this version, the thing that generated these, all we did was encode distances, right? The channels that we gave it was for x, y, and z distances. We didn't give it, electronegativity differences or number of valence electrons. Presumably, you could add those as channels and run this again. In practice, we've tried that, and it's not working. It's been a real pain in the butt. So we're still figuring out what to do with that. But I think it should be something we can resolve. So where's this land, right? I think it's sort of here-ish, right? All of a sudden, we have these generative models that can turn out things that are at least convincing enough to do something with them. And I say that because when I presented this at the Gordon conference, I had two people in the audience see this compound. It was a holmium, I can't remember what, nickel compound, text their postdocs and say, try and make this. They both made it, and by dinner, I'm getting dinner at the cafeteria at the Gordon, And they both said, you know what? It's actually the right symmetry. The basis is wrong a little bit, but it's like, that's pretty wild, right? And this is just getting better all the time. So I think what we're seeing is sort of in the same time frame, the same sort of rapid improvement in generative models that are going to allow us to actually find new materials instead of just machine learning models that allow us to screen among known materials, the ones that have the properties we care about, I think. Okay? Here's another example of, I think it shows you convincingly the improvement of the models. What you're seeing here, you've got 3 figures. On the left, you're seeing for just the vanilla GAN. In gray, the histograms is showing you the types of atoms that it predicts. If you let it just generate 50,000 structures, and then you bin all the elements that it uses, it thinks every compound should basically be a transition metal actinide, right? It's not using the other stuff. But in salmon color, you see the real distribution from which it was trained, which is a lot of oxygen, no noble gases, right? Things that exist in nature, right? So there's a lot of things that it could choose from, but what it's doing is what we call mode collapse. It's only predicting small regions of the available space that it should be using. Now you compare that to a Wasserstein GAN, and it's better. It's sampling over the breadth of the options available much more effectively, but it still doesn't realize that things like oxygen are much more common than krypton, right? So its chemistry is not as going to be effective. And then you compare that to the diffusion models, where it's learning the breadth and the prevalence of these different elemental constituents of the compounds that it generates. And you see this across all the different metrics that you can look at, lattice parameters. Like here's showing you space group. Again, the GAN thinks mode collapse, everything is these space groups. Wasserstein thinks, heck, everything's available. And then we learned that actually, even though there's 230 different space groups, only like 7 of them are really that common. And the diffusion model is doing a better job of finding those. And in 6 months, when there's something even better than stable diffusion, I expect we'll see an improvement once again. And then one last thing that we did to sort of compare these was to look at, say, OK, you generated 50,000 fake materials. OK, now that you got the sieve card for those, we can pass this through a machine learning model to predict some of the properties that you might care about, so band gap or modulus or Poisson's ratio, whatever else you have. And we can compare those to the distribution that you see from the training data set from which it was trained. So this is the real sieve violin plot of final energy, whatever that is. And then here's the vanilla GAN, Wasserstein, diffusion. And what I generally see is, again, the same sort of things we've been seeing before, where diffusion is just outperforming. OK, so going forward, there's lots of cool things that we can do with this. One thing that is we're not ready to publish yet, but we're working on is trying to use language models with this. Because instead of just strictly defining using the sieve card to our crystal to ping representation, you could now start to do conditional generation if you introduce a text version of, if you can introduce a model that goes from text to your crystal to ping. And the way that we're doing that is by essentially using things like ChatGPT and saying this description of a material, which comes from, say, RoboCrystallographer, corresponds to this crystal to ping output. Learn that relationship given a bunch of examples, and then I don't have to give it the crystal to ping description. I can give it a human-like description of a material. So the goal is, again, going back to what we tried to achieve originally, I want to be able to describe something like chemists do. I want to say it has offset layers of corner-shared ALO6 octahedra, some things that you can get out of RoboCrystallographer. I want to train it off of those so we can actually start generating these materials. It's not there yet. It's coming soon. OK. I hope I've convinced you that generative models are moving in the direction of being useful. They're certainly, I think, interesting to me, and they're moving the right way to be useful. But when I tell people about the machine learning approaches out there, a lot of the times, let's take the example. We found some new super hard materials using the sort of traditional machine learning approach, not generative models. And it was great. We found the 10th and 11th hardest materials ever discovered, something that mankind's been after for thousands and thousands of years. And yet, I go to present this at a meeting, and they say, pretty nice, but you're telling me that your new super hard materials are transition metal borocarbides. Like, that's not very surprising, right? That's what everything else is that's super hard. So that stung, right, a little bit, and that's sort of stuck with me. Like, how do we make our generative models or any machine learning model? How do we take that approach and force it to do something away from the distribution of data from which it's seen? Is that even possible? So, scratching our heads about that, we decided to come up with a new approach that we call Discover. The Discover algorithm stands for descending from stochastic clustering variance regression. It was really just for the acronym, I'll be honest. It does include these things. But the idea here is that we're going to build a machine learning model that has an additional penalization if you predict things that are chemically similar to regions of high density in terms of chemical or structural space. The original paper that we published, just came out last year in Digital Discovery, only uses chemistry. So this doesn't include structural diversity. We're working on that now. But it does include chemical similarity. And we talked about this for a long time to do it. And I didn't know how to actually implement it because we didn't have a measure of chemical similarity. What do I mean by that? What I mean is this, like if I give you a matrix of 10 different compounds and I ask everyone in this room to populate this matrix with chemical similarity, I would end up with as many different matrices as there are people in this room. Because what metrics are you going to use? Like how do you define that problem? Some people would say, well, if they share elements, then they're more like them. And others say, no, it's not just elements, it's the number of valence electrons. Or it's an ill-defined problem. So we didn't know how to do this, and yet we needed this to come up with the tool that we ended up building. Fortunately, our friends at Liverpool, where I'm now spending my sabbatical, that's the reason I went there, Matt Rosinski's group, Cameron Hargreaves, Mike Galta, Sam Dyer, these people, or Sam, sorry, or Sam on there. Anyways, they came up with a great tool that they call the element mover's distance. It uses the earth mover's distance that I was talking about earlier, the Wasserstein distance. It uses that same approach, but it uses an approach to now give you a single metric value that tells you how similar compounds are to one another. And it's pretty good. It at least lines up with my intuition of chemical similarity. You could come up with others if you want. We made Discover modular, so if you want to swap in a different chemical distance metric, you could do so. And again, there's different types of ways that you can compare it. I'm going to skip this slide. The point is that once you have this distance metric, now you can do like dense map embedding. So instead of just doing like a UMAP embedding, which just embeds your points, dense map embeddings do something slightly different in that they take into account regions of density, right? You're actually learning what's the density gradient in these regions of your plot. So you clearly see that this is where you find all your elements in training data set when you do a composition-based feature vector embedding. But now you have regions of high density. So you could say, here's sort of B dragons. Like maybe this is like your noble gas oxides. They're not going to exist because chemically they can't exist. But maybe it's just nobody's ever looked there before and they are possibly stable. And now we have a tool that allows us to explore these regions. So for example, if what you want is a high performing material, like I was after new super hard materials and I didn't care about chemical novelty, great. Then you can go for these things that are your highest over here. But we've now introduced a new axis that's orthogonal to performance, which is a chemical novelty axis, which allows you to explore the entire trade-off. Maybe what you're after is high performance, but maybe what you're after is funky new chemistries that might be kind of good for that application too. I think a lot of scientists, that's where they're at. They're interested in unusual chemistries, and now we have a tool that can do that. Hopefully we're going to expand this to another axis, which shows you structure very soon. It's not done yet. Let me show you one last thing before we're done out of time, I think. We're just about there. Let me show you that I think that this works. So to show that this works, we're going to do an example where I'm going to take bulk modulus for a bunch of known materials. I'm going to hide the top, what are they, 2%, which basically anything over 300 gigapascals, basically, we're going to hide it. And we're going to ask it using the Discover algorithm to find those things. That's the one task. So from a performance standpoint, we're saying these hidden materials that are in our validation set, find them, given X number of iterations. I think we give it 900 tries, right? Now, the other thing we're going to ask it to do is, if you care about chemical novelty, find interesting chemistries. Well, how do you define that? What metric do you use? One thing you could say, all right, relative to the training data that it saw, how many new atoms does it use, right? That's not a great one, because there's only a few to pick from, and you're giving it 900 cycles. It's going to use all the atoms pretty quickly. Another one, though, is you could say, how many new unique chemical formula prototypes is it using? That's maybe a better one. And there's a few other metrics we came up with, but I don't remember them. You can see in our paper what we used. But here's the ones I'm going to show you today. And then you're going to have your model built in different ways. First off, the baseline is going to be random search. If you randomly selected compounds from the ones available, how do you do? And then we're going to use Discover algorithm with 3 different modes. One biased towards performance, one biased towards novelty, and one that's a 50-50. And let's see how we do. Again, there's a lot going on here, so forgive me. But the top 4 figures on the top row, paying attention to those first, what we're looking there is the cumulative fraction of those extraordinary materials that it was able to find using random search, novelty search, 50-50, and performance search. What you see is that when you just have it select randomly from the available compounds, it finds almost none of them, right? There was 200 or so compounds it should have found. It only found 20 in 900 cycles. Not very good. Novelty doesn't do much better because, again, the loss function was not telling it to focus on performance. It was focusing on chemical novelty. Performance, it finds them all quite quickly. And then what I think is so cool is this 50-50 model. Across all the metrics, you see this really great ability to combine, yes, it's good performing materials, but we're able to explore interesting chemistries with this sort of 50-50. And you could tune it any way you want, right? It's a Pareto front, so you could train it however exactly you want. But I think it's a pretty slick tool that allows us as scientists to use the machine learning models that we've now come to know and love and pair them with this approach that forces us to get out of the chemical family space where we're used to working and suggest unusual things that might be helpful. So this is great. Everything we do is open and online, open source. It's all on GitHub. We usually do it while we're developing it, so you can see it as it's rolling out. This one, for example, you can download it here if you want. We introduced some slick things with it. The discover class and adapt classes in Python I think are going to be useful that people could build onto going forward. And it's available, and it's pretty well documented. So let me wrap up and just maybe end on this slide and say, this was sort of a fire hose of information with generative models. And if this is interesting to you, we have some resources available for you. First off, I have a lot of videos on YouTube that I put up there starting 6 years ago. I think we have over 600 now. And I've tried to organize them by topic. So there's a whole playlist for materials informatics, for example. This says it has 30. I think it's up to 60 now, different videos just on informatics. So we talked briefly about convolutional neural networks. You can see the whole gory hour-long discussion of how they work if you want to here. So we try and make these available. There's also, basic intro to material science classes, software ones. There's a ceramics course on there, and it's growing all the time. And then the second thing I want to point out is this Materialism podcast. We basically made the podcast that we wanted to listen to that didn't exist. I was annoyed that most of them are boring interviews, and we just wanted to do something that we found more engaging. We try and keep it. I think an undergrad could understand it pretty clearly. We try and explain things pretty basically while also introducing state-of-the-art stuff. So anyways, I'll wrap up with this slide, and I appreciate your attention.